They laughed when the lawyer handed him a single dollar, but none of them noticed the one thing the old man had hidden for the only person he truly trusted. The conference room on the 32nd floor of Whitaker and Hale law offices overlooked downtown Missoula, Montana. Gray clouds drifted slowly across the winter sky, casting long shadows over the city below. Around the polished oak table sat members of the Dawson family, dressed in tailored suits and expensive coats, each waiting to hear how the fortune of the late Robert Dawson would be divided. Some checked their phones. Others exchanged quiet smiles. They had waited months for this day. At the far end of the table sat Graham Wilder. At 68 years old, the retired Army veteran looked out of place among the wealthy heirs. His weathered denim jacket had seen more winters than most of the people in the room. Deep lines marked his face, earned through decades of service, loss, and hard work. Beside his chair lay Huron, a large German shepherd with alert amber eyes and a calm, disciplined posture. Unlike the others, Graham had not come expecting anything. Robert Dawson had not been family. Years earlier, after Graham's divorce left him with almost nothing, Robert had offered him occasional work maintaining a remote property in the mountains. Over time, the two men had formed a quiet friendship built on mutual respect. While others competed for Robert's attention, Graham simply showed up when he was needed. He fixed fences, cleared snow, delivered supplies, and when Robert's health began to decline, Graham visited even when there was no work to be done. Across the table, several relatives glanced toward him with obvious amusement. One woman whispered something to her husband. Both smiled. They knew Graham wasn't one of them. To them, he was simply an old veteran who happened to know the deceased. The attorney, Charles Mercer, adjusted his glasses and opened the final page of the will. The room grew silent. Earlier in the reading, millions of dollars in assets had already been distributed. Vacation homes, investment accounts, company shares, luxury vehicles. Piece by piece, the fortune had been claimed. Only one final entry remained. Mercer cleared his throat. To Graham Wilder. Several heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. Graham remained still. Huron's ears twitched slightly. Mercer continued reading. In recognition of his loyalty and friendship, I leave Graham Wilder the sum of $1 United States. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then came the laughter. Soft at first, then louder. Someone shook their head. Another person smirked openly. One man near the window chuckled and muttered, "That's cold." Graham looked down as Mercer slid a crisp $1 bill across the table. The green paper stopped directly in front of him. Huron slowly raised his head and watched. Graham stared at the bill without speaking. The laughter continued around him. He had faced worse moments in life, much worse. Finally, he picked up the dollar and folded it carefully before placing it inside his jacket pocket. Then he stood, without anger, without embarrassment, without a single complaint. Huron rose beside him immediately. The German shepherd stayed close as Graham turned toward the door. Most of the room had already lost interest. To them, the story was over. But as Graham reached the exit, something unexpected happened. Charles Mercer looked up from the documents. For just a second, his eyes met Graham's. There was something unusual in the attorney's expression. Not pity, not sympathy. Something else. Something deliberate. Then Mercer gave the smallest nod imaginable. Graham frowned slightly, but continued walking. Outside the conference room, the hallway felt strangely quiet. Huron walked at his side as they headed toward the elevators. Graham reached into his pocket and touched the folded dollar bill. Something felt different. The paper seemed thicker than it should have been. He stopped, slowly unfolded the bill, and hidden inside, pressed flat against the paper, where no one in the room could have seen it, was a small silver token engraved with a set of numbers. The moment Huron saw it, the German shepherd froze, staring at the strange object as if he recognized something Graham did not. The elevator doors opened onto the parking garage beneath the building, and the cold Montana air drifted through the concrete structure. Graham stood beside his aging pickup truck, turning the small silver token over in his hand. The numbers engraved into the surface looked like coordinates, but before he could study them further, Huron stepped closer and pressed his nose against the token. The German shepherd sniffed carefully, then looked up at Graham with unusual focus. "You smell something, boy?" Graham asked quietly. Huron let out a low huff and nudged the token again. Graham frowned. The metal carried a faint scent he could not identify. Not oil, not dirt. Something older. His phone suddenly vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Graham answered cautiously. "This is Graham." A familiar voice came through. "Do not throw that token away." Graham immediately recognized Charles Mercer. "What exactly is this?" Graham asked. There was a brief pause. "Not over the phone," Mercer replied. "Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow?" Graham glanced at the darkening sky. "Why not now?" "Because several people from that room are already asking questions." Graham's expression hardened. "Questions about me?" "Questions about what Robert left you." Graham looked down at the token. "I thought you said he left me $1. Mercer lowered his voice. "Meet me at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, Pine Ridge Diner, Highway 12. And if I do," another pause, "then I will explain why Robert spent 15 years preparing for this moment." The call ended. Graham stared at the screen. 15 years. The words lingered in his mind. He climbed into the truck and started the engine. Huron settled into the passenger seat, but instead of lying down, he remained upright, watching the token in Graham's hand. Snow began falling as they drove west toward the mountains. By the time they reached Graham's cabin, nearly 2 inches had settled across the ground. The cabin sat alone among towering pines, 20 miles from the nearest town. It was small, weathered, and quiet, the kind of place most people overlooked. Inside, Graham lit the fireplace and placed the token on the kitchen table. Huron immediately walked over and sat beside it. "You are acting like that thing is talking to you," Graham muttered. He poured himself a cup of coffee and studied the engraving again. The coordinates were clear. Beneath them was a single letter, R. Robert. Suddenly, headlights swept across the cabin window. Graham froze. Nobody visited after dark. Huron was already on his feet. The German Shepherd moved silently to the front door. Another set of headlights appeared behind the first. Then another. 3 vehicles. Graham stepped closer to the window and carefully looked outside. Expensive SUVs sat at the edge of his property. The same kind of vehicles he had seen outside the law office earlier that day. A car door opened, then another. Figures stepped into the snow. Huron's ears rose sharply. Graham's grip tightened around the coffee mug. Through the falling snow, one of the visitors lifted a flashlight and called out. "Mr. Wilder, we just want to ask you a few questions." Huron suddenly turned away from the door. Instead, he stared directly at the fireplace. Then he began growling softly at the stone wall behind it. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the cabin was the crackling fire. Huron stood rigid beside the hearth, his eyes fixed on the stone wall. Outside, the visitors waited in the snow. A flashlight beam moved across the front porch. "Mr. Wilder?" The voice called again. "We are not here to cause trouble. We only want to talk." Graham ignored the door. His attention had shifted completely to Huron. The dog rarely reacted without reason. Years earlier, during search operations, Huron had learned to notice details most people missed. Graham stepped closer to the fireplace. "What is it, boy?" Huron let out another low growl and pressed his nose toward a section of stone near the floor. Graham knelt and ran his hand along the surface. At first it felt ordinary, cold, rough, solid. Then his fingers touched something different, a narrow groove hidden between 2 stones. "That is strange," he murmured. Outside, another voice spoke. This one sounded familiar. "Graham, we know you are in there." Graham recognized it immediately. Victor Dawson. Robert Dawson's nephew. One of the men who had laughed the loudest during the reading of the will. Huron's ears twitched at the sound of the voice, but his attention quickly returned to the wall. Graham grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shined it along the stonework. The groove became clearer. It formed a nearly invisible outline, a square shape built directly into the fireplace foundation. His pulse quickened. "Robert," he whispered. Suddenly there was a knock at the front door, not aggressive, just persistent. "Graham," Victor called. "We only have a few questions about what Mercer gave you." Graham frowned. They already knew. Somehow they knew about the token. That realization made him even less interested in opening the door. Huron suddenly pawed at the floor beside the stone wall. Once, twice, then a third time. Graham moved the nearby firewood rack and discovered an old iron ring, mounted low against the stone. It had been painted to match the fireplace and was almost impossible to notice. "Good boy," Graham said quietly. He wrapped his fingers around the ring and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then a faint click echoed inside the wall. Graham froze. Huron immediately stepped backward. A narrow section of stone shifted outward less than an inch. Graham stared in disbelief. Hidden inside the fireplace was a concealed compartment. Outside, the voices grew more impatient. "Graham," Victor called. "Open the door." Graham ignored him completely. He carefully pulled the hidden panel wider. Dust drifted into the air. The compartment was small, barely large enough to hold a box. Inside sat a weathered leather journal. Nothing else, no gold, no cash, no documents, just a journal. Graham lifted it carefully. The leather cover was worn with age, but one detail stood out immediately. Embossed into the front were two initials, R.D. Robert Dawson's. Huron sat beside him as Graham slowly opened the cover. The first page contained only a single handwritten sentence. The moment he read it, every muscle in his body tightened. The message said, "If you are holding this journal, Graham, it means they have already started looking for what I hid." The cabin felt smaller after Graham read the sentence. The fire crackled softly while snow tapped against the windows. Outside, the visitors remained near the edge of the property, their flashlights occasionally sweeping across the trees. Inside, Graham turned the page. Huron sat beside him, watching every movement. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's, steady, precise, familiar. Graham began reading aloud. "If you are reading this, it means I ran out of time. It also means the wrong people are already searching." Graham frowned. "Searching for what, Robert?" Huron tilted his head as if listening. The next lines answered part of the question. "For years, my family believed my fortune was sitting in bank accounts, investment firms, and company holdings. They never understood that my most valuable asset was never listed anywhere." Graham leaned closer. His pulse quickened. Another knock echoed from the front door. "Graham," Victor shouted, "we are not leaving until we talk." Graham ignored him and continued reading. "If they discover what I hid before you do, everything I spent 20 years protecting will disappear." Graham shook his head. "You always did enjoy speaking in riddles." Huron suddenly stood and walked toward the window. The German shepherd looked outside and let out a low warning sound. Graham glanced through a narrow opening in the curtain. 2 more vehicles had arrived. The group outside was growing. Back at the table, he turned another page. This time, a folded photograph slipped from the journal and landed on the floor. Graham picked it up. The picture showed Robert standing beside an old mountain cabin. Snow covered the roof. Pines surrounded the clearing. Graham immediately recognized the location. "No way," he whispered. It was a property nearly 60 miles north of his own cabin. Robert had purchased it decades ago and rarely mentioned it. Everyone assumed it had been abandoned. Written on the back of the photograph were 3 words. "Start here first." Graham stared at the image. Huron walked over and sniffed it carefully. The dog's ears immediately perked up. "You recognize something?" Graham asked. Huron nudged the photo with his nose. Then he walked to the kitchen table and stopped beside the silver token. Graham looked from the token to the photograph. Slowly, a connection formed in his mind. He grabbed a road atlas from a nearby shelf and unfolded it across the table. Using the coordinates engraved on the token, he began searching the map. After several minutes, he found them. The coordinates pointed directly to the same region where the old cabin stood. Graham leaned back in disbelief. "Robert, what exactly did you leave behind?" At that moment, his phone rang again. "Charles, sir." Graham answered immediately. "You need to leave now," Mercer said without greeting. "What happened?" Graham asked. Mercer's voice sounded tense. "Someone accessed records that should have remained sealed. They know about the northern property." Graham looked down at the photograph. "How many people know?" A pause followed. Then Mercer answered quietly, "Too many." Before Graham could respond, Huron suddenly rushed toward the front window. The German shepherd stared into the darkness beyond the vehicles. Not at the visitors, not at the road, something deeper in the forest. Then he barked once and fixed his eyes on a lone figure standing motionless among the snow-covered trees. For a moment, nobody moved. Graham stood beside the window, while Huron remained fixed on the dark tree line beyond the clearing. Snow drifted through the beam of a distant flashlight, but the figure standing among the pines never moved. "Do you see him?" Graham asked quietly into the phone. "See who?" Mercer replied. Graham narrowed his eyes. The person was too far away to identify, a heavy coat, A dark hat, nothing more. Then the figure slowly stepped behind a cluster of trees and disappeared. Huron immediately ran to the front door. "Something is not right," Graham muttered. Mercer lowered his voice even further. "Listen carefully. Whatever Robert left behind, he did not trust his family with it. He trusted you." "Why?" Graham asked. "Because you never asked him for anything." Graham glanced at the journal, lying open on the table. Before he could respond, another knock echoed through the cabin. This time it was louder. Victor's voice followed immediately. "Graham, enough of this. Open the door." Graham ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. Huron stood ready beside him. After several seconds of thought, Graham walked to the door and opened it a few inches. Cold air rushed inside. Victor Dawson stood on the porch, wearing an expensive winter coat. Two other relatives waited behind him. "There you are," Victor said. "We were beginning to think you were hiding." Graham remained calm. "What do you want?" Victor forced a smile. "Just a conversation. At 10 o'clock at night?" Graham replied. Victor's smile faded. "Word travels fast. People are saying Mercer gave you something after the reading." Graham shrugged. "People say a lot of things." Victor leaned slightly closer. "Robert never trusted outsiders." Graham looked directly into his eyes. "Then why did he leave me anything at all?" Victor had no answer. The silence stretched between them. Finally, one of the relatives spoke. "If there is another part of the estate, we deserve to know." Graham shook his head. "I do not know what you are talking about." It was technically true. He still had no idea what Robert had hidden. Victor studied him for several seconds before stepping back. "This is not over." "Good night, Victor." Graham closed the door. The vehicles remained outside for another 20 minutes before finally pulling away into the snowstorm. Once the headlights disappeared, the cabin grew quiet again. Huron immediately returned to the table and sat beside the journal. Graham opened it once more. Several pages contained notes about old land surveys, mountain trails, and dates stretching back nearly 20 years. Most made little sense. Then he reached a page marked with a red ribbon. The handwriting changed slightly, as if Robert had written it much later in life. Graham read carefully. "The cabin is only the beginning. The real secret was moved after the winter of 2008. Follow the map, trust the coordinates, and trust the dog." Graham stopped reading. "Trust the dog?" he whispered. Huron lifted his head immediately. Graham looked at him and laughed softly despite everything that had happened. "Looks like Robert left you instructions too, partner." Then something slipped from between the pages and landed on the floor. It was a folded map. Across the top, written in bold black ink, were 4 words that made Graham's heart race. "Property access, Route number 7. The storm had weakened by dawn, leaving a fresh blanket of snow across the mountains. Graham sat at the kitchen table, studying the map, while Huron rested beside the fireplace. The route marked on the paper wound through old logging roads, crossed a frozen creek, and ended deep inside the northern wilderness. Graham traced the path with his finger. 60 miles, he said quietly. Robert really did not make this easy. Huron lifted his head the moment Graham folded the map. The dog was already watching him as if he knew what came next. "Yeah, I know," Graham said with a faint smile. "Looks like we are taking a trip." 2 hours later, the pickup truck rolled north through the mountains. Snow-covered pines lined both sides of the narrow road. The farther they traveled, the fewer signs of civilization remained. Around mid-morning, Graham's phone rang through the truck speakers. "Charles Mercer." "Tell me you have not left yet," Mercer said. "Afraid I cannot do that," Graham replied. "I am already on the road." Mercer sighed. "Then listen carefully. Last night, someone accessed records connected to Robert's northern properties." "Victor?" Graham asked. "Possibly, but he is not the only one searching anymore." Graham glanced at Huron. The German shepherd was staring through the windshield, alert and focused. "You think somebody else knows where I am going?" Mercer hesitated. "I think Robert expected that possibility." The call ended a few minutes later. By noon, Graham reached the turnoff marked on the map. The road ahead looked abandoned. Snow covered most of the tire tracks. A rusted sign leaned sideways near the trees. "Private access road." Graham parked and stepped outside. The cold mountain air bit at his face. Huron jumped down beside him and immediately began sniffing the area. "This way?" Graham asked. Huron moved forward without hesitation. They followed the old road on foot for nearly half a mile. The forest grew quieter with every step. Eventually, the trees opened into a clearing. There it was, the cabin from the photograph, weathered wood, stone chimney, snow-covered roof, exactly as Robert had left it years ago. Graham stared at it in silence. You were hiding something out here all along. Huron suddenly trotted toward the porch. His tail remained stiff. His ears stood upright. The dog stopped near the front steps and began sniffing one specific section of the ground. Graham walked over. What did you find? Huron pawed at the snow. Underneath lay a metal marker partially buried in frozen dirt. Graham brushed away the remaining snow and revealed a symbol stamped into the surface. It matched the engraving on the silver token. His heart immediately began racing. The token, the coordinates, the cabin. They were all connected. He looked toward the front door. A small brass keyhole sat beneath an old handle. Graham slowly removed the silver token from his jacket pocket. To his surprise, the shape matched perfectly. "No way," he whispered. As he carefully inserted the token into the lock, a faint mechanical click echoed from somewhere deep inside the cabin. The click echoed through the cabin like a sound that had been waiting years to be heard. Graham slowly pushed the door open. The hinges groaned softly as cold air drifted from the dark interior. Dust covered nearly every surface. Old furniture sat beneath white sheets. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. "This is what everyone has been chasing," Graham muttered. Huron stepped inside first. The German shepherd moved carefully across the wooden floor, sniffing corners and studying the room with intense focus. Graham followed close behind. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, casting pale beams across the floorboards. Everything appeared untouched. Then Huron suddenly stopped. His ears rose. His body became rigid. "What is it, boy?" Graham asked. Huron turned toward the fireplace. Graham could not help but laugh softly. "Another fireplace? You are starting to develop a pattern." Huron ignored the joke. He approached the stone hearth and began sniffing one particular section near the base. Graham knelt beside him. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed fresh scratches in the dust. Not recent, but newer than the rest of the room. Someone had moved something there years ago. Graham examined the stones carefully. One of them carried the same symbol engraved on the silver token. His pulse quickened. "Robert, what did you build?" He pressed against the marked stone. Nothing happened. He pushed again. Still nothing. Huron suddenly placed one paw against a lower stone. Graham looked down. The lower stone was slightly different in color. He pressed it firmly. A metallic click echoed somewhere beneath the floor. Both Graham and Huron froze. Slowly, a narrow section of the fireplace shifted backward. Hidden behind it was a small compartment. Graham stared in disbelief. Inside sat a sealed metal box no larger than a briefcase. On top rested a folded envelope. His name was written across the front. Graham carefully opened it. The letter inside was short, very short. "If you found this, then Huron is smarter than most people I know. The box is not the treasure. It is only the key. Follow the next coordinates. Trust nobody who arrives after you. Robert." Graham shook his head. "You really enjoyed this, did you not?" He opened the metal box. Inside was a leather document case, an old brass compass, and another map. This one covered a much larger area of the Bitterroot Mountains. Several locations had been crossed out. Only one remained circled in red, a place labeled Blackstone Quarry. Graham studied the map. The quarry sat nearly 30 miles farther north. Deep in rugged terrain, few people visited anymore. Before he could examine it further, Huron suddenly turned toward the nearest window. A low growl rolled from his chest. Graham followed his gaze. Outside, far beyond the clearing, sunlight reflected briefly off a windshield. A vehicle sat partially hidden among the trees. Someone had followed them, and whoever it was now knew exactly which cabin they had entered. Graham remained perfectly still as he watched the distant vehicle through the cabin window. The reflection disappeared a second later, but the uneasy feeling remained. Huron continued staring toward the trees. "I saw it too," Graham said quietly. "We are not alone out here." He folded the new map and slipped it into the leather document case. Whatever Robert had hidden at Blackstone Quarry, other people were getting closer. Within minutes, Graham and Huron were back in the truck heading deeper into the mountains. The road became rougher with every mile. Snow covered most of the old tracks, and several fallen branches forced Graham to slow down. The quarry sat far beyond the areas marked on modern maps. Few people had reason to travel there anymore. Late in the afternoon, the forest finally opened. Massive stone walls rose above the trees. The abandoned quarry stretched across nearly 20 acres. Rusted equipment sat frozen in place, like forgotten monuments from another era. Graham parked near an old maintenance building. Huron jumped out immediately and began scanning the area. "This place has not seen much activity in years," Graham said. The wind carried only silence. Then Huron suddenly moved toward the far side of the quarry. Graham followed. They crossed snow-covered ground until they reached a section of exposed rock near the northern wall. Huron stopped beside a weathered steel marker partially hidden beneath ice. The same symbol appeared again, the symbol from the token, the symbol from the cabin. Graham knelt beside it. "You keep finding them, do you not?" Huron wagged his tail once. Graham studied the marker carefully. An arrow had been engraved beneath the symbol. It pointed toward an old storage structure built directly into the quarry wall. The heavy steel door looked decades old. As they approached, Graham noticed something unusual. The lock had already been opened. His expression hardened immediately. Someone had arrived before them. Huron lowered his head and sniffed the snow. Fresh footprints, several sets, only a few hours old. Graham pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust covered the floor, but a narrow path led toward the back wall. "They found this place," he whispered. Huron moved ahead. At the rear of the structure stood a large steel safe built into concrete. Its door remained closed. A yellow envelope rested on top. Graham carefully picked it up. His name appeared on the front once again. He opened it and unfolded the letter inside. Robert's handwriting greeted him immediately. "If you are reading this, then you arrived before they solved the final piece. Good. Everything inside the safe legally belongs to you. The documents establish ownership of mineral rights purchased decades ago and protected through private trusts. Current valuation exceeds $50 million. Graham stared at the page. $50 million. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he looked down at Huron. "You found it, partner." Huron sat proudly beside him. But before Graham could continue reading, a voice echoed from the entrance behind them. "Looks like we finally caught up." Graham slowly turned. Victor Dawson stood in the doorway, smiling as several members of the family stepped into the building behind him. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Snow drifted through the open doorway behind Victor Dawson and the others. Graham remained standing beside the safe while Huron sat calmly at his side. Victor's eyes moved immediately to the documents in Graham's hand. "Well," Victor said with a thin smile, "looks like the family mystery is finally solved." Graham folded the letter carefully. Apparently, Robert disagreed. Victor stepped forward. "Those assets belong to the Dawson family." "That is not what the letter says," Graham replied. One of the relatives pointed toward the safe. "You expect us to believe he left everything to you?" Before Graham could answer, another voice echoed from outside. "Actually, that is exactly what happened." Everyone turned. Charles Mercer entered the building carrying a thick legal folder. Victor's confident expression immediately faded. "What are you doing here?" Mercer stopped beside Graham, finishing Robert's instructions. He opened the folder and removed several notarized documents. Robert established a series of private trusts more than 20 years ago. The mineral rights, royalties, and associated holdings were never part of the public estate. Victor shook his head. "That is impossible." "No," Mercer replied calmly. "It is legally documented." He handed one document to Graham. Robert was very specific. The beneficiary is Graham Wilder. Silence filled the building. Victor stared at the papers. Why would he do that? Graham looked down at the final page of Robert's letter, because he already answered that question. He began reading aloud. "To my family, if you are hearing these words, understand this. Wealth without character eventually destroys itself. Graham never asked me for money, never asked for favors, never asked for ownership. He showed loyalty when there was nothing to gain. That is why I trust him." Nobody spoke. Graham continued. "The inheritance is not a reward for being present. It is a reward for being honorable." Victor looked away. The words hit harder than any argument. Huron quietly walked to Graham's side and sat against his leg. Graham smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. "There is one more thing," Mercer said. He pulled out a small digital recorder. Robert's familiar voice filled the room. If Huron helped find this place, then give that dog a steak dinner for the rest of his life. Even Graham laughed. The tension in the room finally broke. Weeks later, the legal process concluded exactly as Robert intended. The assets transferred to Graham without challenge. The value exceeded $50 million. News spread quickly across Montana. The same people who once laughed now spoke very differently. But Graham never changed. He renovated his small cabin, created a Veterans Assistance Foundation, and funded search and rescue programs throughout the region. Most importantly, he established a sanctuary where retired service dogs could live comfortably after years of loyalty and work. At the entrance stood a bronze plaque. It carried only a few words, dedicated to Huron and every loyal companion who never walks away. One quiet evening, months later, Graham sat on his porch watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. Huron rested beside him, older now but just as watchful. Graham looked across the valley and smiled. "You know something, partner?" Huron lifted his head. "Robert was right. You really are smarter than most people I know." Huron's tail thumped once against the wooden porch. The mountains stood silent around them. The secrets were finally uncovered. The truth had been revealed, and, for the first time in many years, Graham Wilder had everything he needed. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.